I built my channel on Pikmin. As the Pikmin guru, I've played a lot of Pikmin in my day. A whole lot of the original Pikmin, a ton of Pikmin 2. That was actually like my favorite game growing up. Played a good bit of Pikmin 3. I did an entire, I basically live streamed my entire playthrough of Pikmin 4 when that game first came out. So I've played a good bit of Pikmin, and I've figured all four of the Pikmin games, now that I think about it, are like really, really different. It doesn't click at first because like every single game you're kind of doing the same thing, but it's also completely different every time. I mean, in the first game you're rebuilding your ship, and the second one you're still collecting stuff, but you're like, it's a collectathon of way more stuff. You're going for like treasures that are all over the place. Pikmin 3 is just its own thing. Pikmin 4 is also different. Like it's so different in every Pikmin game that it really asks the question, what's the best Pikmin game? For most franchises, it's a bit of an easier question to answer. I mean, it's always going to be subjective, at least to a point, when you're talking about the best of any game franchise, because people are going to prefer different things. But since Pikmin, each game in the series is so radically different from the next, it makes things even more different, because now not only do you have to contest with like different game mechanics and story plots, you also have like different end goals you're trying to reach each and every time. Instead of a similar comparable end goal, there are different mechanics, things like that. So I figured, who's better than the Pikmin guru to determine what Pikmin game in the franchise is the best Pikmin game overall? To start off, we kind of have to go through each one of the Pikmin games, because at the end of the day, each Pikmin game is so different. I think it's worth going over which game does what best, because each one is so radically different from the next. And I'm not talking about you.
What is that? Ugh, it's hideous!
So starting it off with Pikmin 1 right here. This came out in 2001, not long after the release of the GameCube, and it's a really good game. It's an excellent game. The controls are definitely there. It really established a solid baseline for mechanics that would really carry into the franchise's future. Like, when you think about it, the base controls of everything are still like ingrained in Pikmin. Like, even in Pikmin 3 Deluxe and 4 on the Switch, the controls on the Pro Controller feel so similar to how they do on the original GameCube controller. Of course, there's some differences here and there, but like the core mechanics and things that you use are all still very much there. Some mechanics weren't really the best. It was missing a couple things. One thing that does come to mind is like, can't really switch Pikmin while you're like holding them. It's harder to like get the Pikmin that you want at that moment in time if you have a crowd of mixed colors of Pikmin. And that didn't get fixed until Pikmin 2, where they gave you the option to like switch through the Pikmin that you're holding on your back. To be fair, they did re-release Pikmin 1 on the Wii here, and this kind of gave it all of the controls from Pikmin 2. And I think this game, this is the definitive way to play Pikmin 1, in my opinion. It's far better, in my opinion. It just does such a great job. Like, if you've never played Pikmin before and you're like, oh, what do I play? I mean, if you have the GameCube Pikmin sitting around, it's not a bad game by any means. But I mean, if you have this or you're looking to buy it, this is where to start right here. It's definitely good. And one of the things that I think it establishes right out of the gate is difficulty is a huge factor of Pikmin games. Because the first thing that you know, like right when you go through the opening cutscene, which is a short like 1 minute cutscene with no dialogue or anything, it just throws you into the game. And then you get a short monologue from Olimar about how he's crash landed, he needs to rebuild his ship, and he only has 30 days of life support on this planet before he will succumb to the poisonous atmosphere. That very quickly establishes like, okay, hard timeline. And after the first couple days, enemies start to get tougher and tougher and tougher as you go through the game. And it requires management of your Pikmin, careful planning, and good use of your time, because you don't have a lot of it. You only have so much, so you have to use it well. So I think that really establishes right out of the gate that difficulty is a big factor of Pikmin. Not necessarily the day limit thing, because as we'll see later, they kind of don't follow that trend forever. It goes beyond the 30-day thing, because if there were no enemies, or the enemies were relatively weak, getting 30 parts in 30 days wouldn't be a challenge. Getting 30 parts in 20 days would hardly be a challenge. It really comes down to not just managing the time, but also fighting lots of hard enemies, because a lot of enemies in Pikmin 1 are pretty tough. Beady Longlegs requires very careful planning. Like, any new player's first time going against Beady Longlegs, they're going to get rolled because they're going to bring a big party in there. BD's going to stomp on half of them, and they're going to be like, well, what the hell? And things like that. The Emperor of Bulblacks is a monster that you literally need to like solve the puzzle, come back the next day, and like spend most of the next day just fighting him because of how much health he has and how tough he is and how many Pikmin he can kill at one time. His attacks are really tough to beat, especially in the second phase where he like jumps around. They can be tough to predict and track. There's a lot of tough enemies in this game. The Armored Cannon Beetle comes to mind. They're all ones that, like, once you've played Pikmin a dozen times, like, you're gonna beat them pretty easily with only losing a couple Pikmin, if any. But when it's your first couple times through, it really establishes, like, hey, you can't mess around because we're not going to. You know what I mean? So if you don't manage your time well and you don't manage your Pikmin well, and you lose a lot of them really quickly, you're going to have a really tough time later on. So that I think it really promotes less the time thing and more just a difficulty thing. Anyways, that's Pikmin 1. I feel like that kind of encompasses this game pretty well. Many people say like, oh, Pikmin 1's the best game because it's got the hardest. It's the hardest because it has a time cap. And that's not necessarily true in my opinion. I think it's more just, it comes down to the difficulty of the game and its demand for you to manage your resources and time to the best of your ability. Because if you don't, it makes things harder for you later on in the game. Moving on to Pikmin 2. This game, it kind of turns Pikmin 1 upside down. So you no longer have a day limit. That's a thing. Yeah, the day limit's gone. It's kind of crazy how they just kind of like immediately threw that recipe out the door. You still have days, of course, but the difficulty, like in the day counter thing, isn't there. You have as many days on the planet as you need. That's definitely an interesting factor of Pikmin 2. So everybody's like, oh, well, Pikmin 2's easy because it doesn't have a day counter. You can just do whatever you want as many times as you need to. But that's not really where the difficulty comes from. Since there's no time cap, the difficulty has to come from somewhere else, and basically this comes from taking Pikmin 1 enemies and making them tougher, as well as introducing new enemies that are more tough and have more gimmicks going on. This includes making like more bosses that are tougher to kill. There are a few enemies that actually regenerate health after dying, and if you don't take them back to the ship or back to the onion to convert them into money or into Pikmin, they'll eventually revive themselves and come back after your Pikmin. That's really where the difficulty of Pikmin 2 comes from. And of course you could argue, well, it takes more than just the difficulty of the enemies, and that's true, but keep in mind, a lot of the toughest enemies in the game are in the caves, where you can't really leave and just go home whenever you want, unless you like let Olimar and Louie die, but then you go back to the servers with none of the stuff you collected on the way there, and all of your Pikmin are dead, so you still lose a lot doing that anyways. So the difficulty doesn't really come from a day counter, but it comes from being in this cave and the need to manage your resources down there well. So that's really where the difficulty of this game comes in, and I think it really delivers here more than people give it credit for. People will always tell you, oh, well, you get purple Pikmin so early, and they make every fight so easy, and that's not actually true. It does make fighting like the smaller enemies very, very easy. You can easily roll Bulborbs and Bulbears for days on end with 20 purple Pikmin, but I feel like that applies much, much less to the bosses. Think of all the toughest bosses in Pikmin 2. You think of things like the final Empress Bulblacks fight, where she has the baby Bulborbs and the rocks that fall out of the sky. You think of Man-at Legs. You think of the final boss, the Titan Dweevil, and none of those bosses you can really effectively use purple Pikmin better than you could, you know, regular old red Pikmin or something like that. And that really just goes to show that, like, yeah, the purple Pikmin help a lot with like normal progress of the game, especially in the overworld. But in the caves, you're kind of like, you kind of want to spare their use a little bit, so you don't let them die, so you have them for later, because they're very difficult to come by. And of course, they're fairly easy to keep alive as long as you keep them away from electricity. But you know, they're very valuable. And so you kind of want to spare your use of them a little bit, and you kind of want to not use them in some of these boss fights that I just mentioned. Like, you really can't use them in the fight against the pileated Snaggart as well, because the head is so high up off the ground. It's kind of hard to get them up there. You're not going to get the stun from the purple Pikmin very often at all, if ever. More just advisable to rip a spicy spray and just throw a bunch of yellows and reds at its head. And unlike the Man at Legs fight, especially the first time you fight it, there's a lot of water, so you want to take blues there. And when you think the Titan Dweevil, like, purple Pikmin are, like, honestly not even that useful for that fight. If you go back and watch my Pikmin 2 Let's Play from back last year, you'll see when I get to the final boss, I literally don't even use purples. I only use yellows, because one of his attacks is a giant electric attack, covers a massive amount of the field, can be very difficult and unpredictable at times, and the electricity just literally insta-kills Pikmin. So you don't want to take purples into there because they're just going to die. You want to take the yellows because they're the only ones that can't get instantly killed. A lot of the biggest fights that you're going to be in, a lot of the toughest fights, the purple Pikmin see no use at all. And I feel like that's where a lot of the difficulty comes in, because it's just like, not just like, oh, how do you use your resources? It's also, how do I best, like, what Pikmin's the best for this situation? Other than that, though, in Pikmin 2, it really heavily expanded on Pikmin 1's mechanics, cleaned up a lot of controls. Like I said, added quality of life things just to, you know, make it so that you select what Pikmin you're trying to throw more easily, things like that. A lot of people say that Pikmin 2 has the best game engine, and I highly agree with that. And it's a very, very good game engine. So I think at the end of the day, it's definitely a very difficult game, just in a bit of a different way, if that makes sense. It's still Pikmin difficult. So I think that it definitely holds up in terms of the difficulty thing, regardless of what people say about it not having a day limit. So then after that, we had the Wii era, and we didn't really get any new Pikmin games. We got Pikmin 1 and 2 here on the Wii. We got these re-releases here. We got these re-releases on the Wii of Pikmin 1 and 2 that gave them Wii controls. I think these are like some of the best Pikmin releases to date. I think these, unironically, if you've never played a Pikmin game before and you're trying to get into the series, this is not a bad place at all to start. They're fairly inexpensive on the Wii, at least compared to their GameCube counterparts, especially Pikmin 2. This thing is like $130 for some reason. What the fuck is the deal with you? Yeah, you can pretty easily find copies of Pikmin 1 and 2. You can actually get the Pikmin 1 and 2 on the Switch now. Pikmin 1 plus 2 came out fairly recently, and I've played it. It's really good. It's basically just the Wii ports upscaled to 1080p and shoved onto your Nintendo Switch. The controls are a bit compromised, in my opinion, just because I would rather have a Wii Remote and Nunchuck, but Pikmin 1 plus 2 on the Switch does a very, very serviceable job if you're trying to get into Pikmin. If you just want to pick one up, it's $30, and if you really want to get both, it's only $50 for the two. Of course, they're old games, they're just like upscaled, but I mean, I think it's a really good deal for games that haven't seen a re-release in a long time, and something that you can quickly digitally download. I think it's a good deal. So after the Wii era, after many years, we finally got Pikmin 3. And Pikmin 3, I don't want to say it was a meh release, because it's a good game. There's no getting around that. It's a very clean game. The graphics in this game are gorgeous. It's one of the best looking Wii U games, in my opinion. And they re-released this on Switch years later as Pikmin 3 Deluxe. That still is an amazing looking game. I would argue that it looks better than Pikmin 4 in certain ways. Pikmin 4 is a better looking game overall. However, the lighting in this game, some of the scenery is just so gorgeous in this game. And it was from 2013. They just like cleaned up the graphics and upscaled a little bit, made it run at 60 frames per second on the Switch. It's so good looking. Pikmin 3 came out on the Wii U, and for some reason they expect you to use a gamepad in this game, but you can also use a Wii Remote and Nunchuck, so it's like, it's not that big of a deal. It's not that big of a deal. You can just pick up a Wii Remote and Nunchuck and play it the same way you play the Wii ports of 1 and 2, and it's a great game. However, in terms of it being a Pikmin game, I don't want to get into the rankings of them quite yet. However, it's definitely a lot easier than Pikmin 1 and 2. Enemies compared to Pikmin 2 are a lot easier to kill. There's more ways to kill them more easily. Like, for example, Bulborbs, you can throw them at their eyes now. And with Pikmin 3's lock-on feature, you can actually lock onto their eyes while they're sleeping and just throw a bunch of red Pikmin on their eye right at the beginning of the game and just kill large red Bulborbs in like 3 seconds. There's definitely a less, the enemies are less intimidating overall. There's definitely a few intimidating enemies. There's a couple of side bosses and like the shaggy long legs and the hairy long legs that are, don't get me wrong, very tough. However, you don't need to fight them, and there's only a couple, those are like a couple of the only bosses I can really think of that are like super, super difficult. Like out of all the required bosses, most of them are pretty easy. The Armored Maw Dad is super, super easy. You just throw rock Pikmin at him over and over again until his armor breaks. Then you just throw a bunch of red Pikmin at him and he dies in like a couple of minutes. The only two main bosses that I can think of that are like super, super difficult are the final boss, the Plasm Wraith, and maybe the Quaggled Mire-Clubs. He's not crazy, crazy difficult, but he definitely is a challenge. But like most of the enemies aren't too difficult. They can't kill too many of your Pikmin at one time. This game's definitely just a little easier than the predecessors, which isn't necessarily an awful thing. I think it makes it a little more accessible for new people who haven't played Pikmin before. But if the enemies are going to be easier, you'd think, okay, well, maybe they'll at least like make it so you sort of have a tighter time cap. It's not like Pikmin 2. And there is a time limit. They start you out with only 3 days on the planet that you can have. As you go through the game, you can find fruits, bring them back to the ship. It converts it into juice that you can use to feed your captains to extend your day counter. Of course, you don't have to get every fruit on your main playthrough. Like in a regular playthrough, you only pick up like maybe half the fruits, if that. But even then, in just the fruits that you run into trying to do your other goals, you'll still run into plenty and plenty of fruit. Like you run into more than enough fruit that you need just by walking around. And I think this could have easily been fixed if they made more of the fruit harder to get, or made each fruit give you a little less juice, so that you were more enticed to kind of go off the beaten path a little bit, stray away a little bit from what you need to do to go after more fruit to give yourself a couple extra days. If you go back and watch my Pikmin 3 playthrough, like I never really went far out of my way to get much fruit at all. I might have gotten half the fruit. I don't remember exactly how much I got, but I might maybe half of the fruit in the game, if that. And I finished the game with like 12 days left or something. It was crazy. So it doesn't really have this impending sense of like, holy shit, I gotta go. You know what I mean? It doesn't really have this impending doom feel to it. The only time where that really happens is sort of right at the beginning, but not really, because it kind of hands you the first couple fruits on a silver platter, and the middle of the game where Louie takes your fruit. But right after that, it's not too hard to get some fruit. There's some pretty close by right where the blue Pikmin are. So I would say it's like not really that big of an impending doom feeling. And on top of that, you get rock Pikmin, which they're not quite as good as purple Pikmin and Pikmin 2, but they make this game really easy. They can't be crushed, so like certain attacks just like don't hurt them. Like these guys are silly and they're cool. Like I think this game is very good. It's like comparative to the other Pikmin games in the series, it's not nearly as difficult across the board. I feel you don't have an impending sense of doom like in Pikmin 1, where you're like, holy shit, I gotta go, I gotta manage my time, I gotta be really careful with what I do. If I lose these Pikmin, I gotta go back and get more. Like in this, it's just like, oh, well, I can get a couple more fruits and give myself a couple extra days. It's not that big a deal. You already have an extra like 10 days anyways, right? I feel like it's a good game objectively. There's nothing wrong with Pikmin 3. I think this is a great game, but in terms of the Pikmin franchise, I think it suffers a little bit in terms of the difficulty factor, which is something that I feel like is an important part of Pikmin, and I'll get into a little bit later. I'll get into like what really makes a Pikmin game a Pikmin game. That's like one of the biggest things I feel like is the difficulty and the need to manage your time and resources well. And this just kind of gives you a lot of resources with rock Pikmin and flying Pikmin and just a lot of availability of Pikmin in general. It's pretty easy to get pretty big numbers in that game. And it's easy to extend your day limit by just picking up more fruit because you don't have to go far out of your way to get more than enough. The bosses aren't too difficult, so I feel like it doesn't demand as much resource management. You could argue that Pikmin 3 Deluxe has the ultra spicy mode that makes it tougher. You could totally argue that makes it tougher, but like that's not the base game. That's not what you play on your first time through. That's not what most people are playing. So I feel like if we're going to really judge it, you got to judge it based off of its standard difficulty. So other than that, I feel like that kind of covers Pikmin 3. Like I said, the ultra spicy mode, it does make it more difficult. It's not really the intended way to play. It's just kind of like a bonus mode when you beat the game already, and it feels very artificial because it lowers the Pikmin cap that you can have. It just feels a little artificial. I don't know, maybe that's just me, maybe that's just a preference thing, but that's what I think of when I think of Pikmin 3, you know what I mean? Moving on.
What the dog doing?
Yeah, Pikmin 4 came out last year, and much to everybody's please, it's a fantastic game. We did wait 10 years for this game, yes, but oh my god, it was worth the wait. This game's really, really good. I had a lot of fun with this game. I streamed the whole series, all the way through like the post game. Do go check that out. It's on the channel. I'll link everything down in the description below. Go check it out. I live streamed the whole thing. Super fun. It's great background noise if you want to just put something on while you're doing homework or eating dinner. But yeah, this game was really, really good. The graphics are gorgeous. The controls are really, really good. I feel like they really figured out what they wanted to do in 3 Deluxe with the Pro Controller and just did all that and more in Pikmin 4. They really just made everything feel really smooth, really simple, and I think they did a great job of it. So going into Pikmin 4 and how it is as a Pikmin game, it is still a Pikmin game, but it's pretty different from the rest of the franchise. I mean, first off, you have this dog. Ochi kind of flips the game on its head because you can kind of like put your Pikmin on its back and like swim with it and do all this other shit with it. Of course, there's like you have to like get upgrades with him, like by training with him. But like the point is you're gonna get most of the upgrades by the end of the game anyways. He can do a lot of stuff for you. He can fight for you. He can pull things back to the onion and the ship for you. And he can like he can even be controlled independently when you get a certain upgrade. So it makes the game feel very different, but I don't think it necessarily completely subtracts from the difficulty. I think they just give you this one extra resource in Ochi because at the beginning of the game, you can't have 100 Pikmin out at a time. It's not until towards the end of the game where you actually collect enough of the flower like in order to have 100 Pikmin out of the onion at a time. I want to say it took almost 20 in-game days, maybe. Maybe I'm crazy, maybe I'm misremembering, but it took me many in-game days to get to the point where I could have 100 Pikmin out of the onion at a time. To compensate for that, you get Ochi. He's a very, very valuable resource. You can get upgrades for him that make him resistant to different elements. You can get things that make him more tough, so he can fight on his own better, deal more damage. You can eventually control him on his own, which is crazy. And I feel like that kind of makes up for the fact that you don't have multiple captains in this game. Because in Pikmin 2, you had 2 captains. In Pikmin 3, you had 3 captains. In this game, you only have your 1 captain, but you get Ochi, so he's kind of a second captain in a lot of ways. A lot of people, I feel like, might look at this and say, oh, he makes the game really easy. And it's not necessarily true, and at least in all aspects of how he operates. He's more of just another resource for your captain to use, but he does make things easier in some ways. Like I said, he can fight for you. He has a charge attack that can do a lot of damage. And if you have your Pikmin sitting on his back while he does that, they can actually get stunned for a little bit. All the Pikmin will jump onto them and deal a shit ton of damage. It will completely evaporate almost any non-boss enemy. It kind of streamlines a lot of fights, in my opinion. So it does take away from the difficulty a little bit in that aspect. And speaking of taking away from the difficulty, Ice Pikmin, bro. To put it lightly, Ice Pikmin are like, they're crazy. You can just throw a bunch of them at your enemy and they'll eventually freeze, and you have so much time. You get like over 10 seconds. They're frozen for an extended period of time. You can just go apeshit on them. You can go ham. It just kind of makes every fight a little easier. Of course, you could say, oh, well, there's a trade-off of like you don't get the corpse, you can't get any Pikmin back from it. It gives you nectar. You're still getting something out of it. You can just kill the smaller enemies that are super easy to kill anyways without Ice Pikmin. Use those to get your Pikmin numbers up as much as you need, and then conserve your numbers by using Ice Pikmin to freeze enemies before you kill them. And then you get nectar to flower up all your Pikmin that you just got from the smaller enemies. At least to me, like that feels like a very streamlined way to just give you a kabillion flower Pikmin. So I don't feel like I have to work for them as much as you do in previous games. That could just be me. But continuing on, difficult bosses do exist. I think it's a little better than Pikmin 3 in this regard, but I think they're still kind of few and far between. There were a few fairly tough bosses that I can think of off the top of my head. The Emperor Bulblax's fight in that game was actually pretty tough. It kind of scared the shit out of me because I like walked into the area where he is, not knowing what was there. I'm like, oh, this is a random little back area. Like, I wonder what's back here. And then I got jump scared by him. I'll have to see if I can find the clip of me playing through Pikmin 4 for the first time, just getting jump scared by his ass. But yeah, I mean, like, enemies aren't really that tough. Some of the bosses are even pretty easy. Like, I remember getting really excited for the Disco Longlegs fight because there was he was part of one of the trailers. But then I kind of went in there and I just kind of beat him in like a couple minutes. It wasn't that difficult. There was another boss. I can't remember what it was off the top of my head. I want to say it was a Wollywog sort of enemy. Big like mini boss towards the end of one of the caves in this game, which I'll get to that in a minute. And I remember somebody in my chat was like, oh dude, this boss is really tough. He like wiped out my squad low key. And so I was like, all right, I see you, bro. Like I'll keep my eyes out. I got into this fight and I just dumped 20 Ice Pikmin on his head. He froze, and I literally killed him in like 10 seconds. He didn't even thaw out. The guy in my chat was like, oh my god, I literally didn't think to do that. That makes things 100 times easier. So it just kind of makes everything so much easier. And you get so many Pikmin in this game. You get your standard red, yellow, and blue, and then you get the rock Pikmin and flying Pikmin from last game, but you also get white Pikmin and purple Pikmin from Pikmin 2 later on. You kind of need white Pikmin for a few of the caves. Purple Pikmin are kind of few and far between, but you can get them and they're really good at fighting. Not quite as good as their broken state in Pikmin 2, but they're still very, very effective. And then you get these stupid-ass ice Pikmin that just freeze and kill literally everything under the sun. Like I said, Ochi can still be used at your disposal. As you get later into the game, you get to some of these harder fights. The fights do get harder, but you get so many more resources by the time that you get there. I feel like difficulty doesn't ramp up enough to compensate for your own power creep, and you kind of catch up a little bit, and it almost gets easier towards the end. Maybe that's just my opinion, but I feel like that's how it felt when I was playing the game. Just like at the end of the day, all the different resources you get at your disposal kind of make most enemies a cakewalk. There's a few tough bosses for sure. You get one cave that's kind of like the submerged castle from Pikmin 2, which I didn't even get into in that game, but that submerged castle is its own beast. Just 5 floors of absolute terror in that game. And this kind of has something like that as well, which I think was a really good inclusion. I had a ton of fun in that cave. That was so cool. But even then, the caves aren't too difficult, and some of them don't even have bosses at the end of them. The real challenge really comes from the Dandori challenges that you find throughout the game when you try to save the leaflings. And I mean, that's fine. Every game's kind of got its own source of difficulty. The thing that I think is really the main flaw with Pikmin 4 is that you can replay the Dandori challenges as much as you want once you beat them the first time. In the hub world, there's a place where you can play them again, so you can just kind of master them. And once you've beaten them the first time and kind of, you know, unlocked that mission and you're able to progress, you collect that leafling. If you're like not happy with how you did there, you can literally go back and try however many times you want. And I feel like that kind of subtracts from the specialty of the moment a little bit. It's just like, oh, well, I screwed up. Like, I only got a silver medal. I really wanted at least a gold, if not a platinum. Why does that really matter if once you beat the game, you could just kind of go back and redo that specific part and just kind of, like, I feel like it takes away from it a little bit. I think it's less of a knock against it than the just across the board lack of difficulty in Pikmin 3. I do feel like it's definitely a little bit of something to talk about, just because it's like, oh, well, I messed up, but it's okay. I can just go back and get a better medal later. I can just retry that Dandori challenge. So that's every Pikmin game. Pikmin 1 through 4 right there. So these are the Pikmin games. All have their own redeeming qualities, their own quirks. So I think it's time to discuss what the hell makes a good Pikmin game. So I think that really the first game here kind of established, you know, a need to really manage your resources. You only have 30 days. You only have so many Pikmin. As you go into the later areas, it can be a bit more difficult to collect Pikmin. And of course, you have to revisit the impact site, which can make gathering numbers pretty easy and quick, but you don't want to go back and waste too many days there because, you know, you only have so many days to beat the game. You know, you want to have at least 2 days at the end of the game so you can fight the Emperor Bullblacks. So you kind of have to be really careful how you balance things. And of course, you could always just go against the wrong enemy at the wrong time, or be not prepared for a bull bear, or get rolled by your first attempt at the armored cannon beetle. And oh, whoops, there goes like 60 of your Pikmin. My bad. And then it's just like, okay, you either got to reset and go from the beginning of the day if you want to do that, or if you're not trying to reset, well, you got to hold that loss. I think controls are another big factor to consider, in my opinion, because when you're playing a game like Pikmin, where it really demands that you know, have very strict management of not only your own captain, but your crew of Pikmin, management of your time and the resources that you have at your disposal, the controls are equally as important as the difficulty of it, because if the controls suck, then the difficulty gets overshadowed by the inability to play the game, and it's just like, oh, well, the game's hard because you can't control it. This game, the controls are good. The game is difficult because the enemies are difficult. The environment challenges you. So I think that controls are a big factor to consider as well, that I don't really hear people talk about that much. So it's something that I wanted to talk about a little bit. Another thing I wanted to talk about, enemy difficulty, pretty obviously. Enemy difficulty in the varying areas, as well as difficulty of certain bosses, making them memorable and tough. Things that you really have to think outside of the box for sometimes. Those are big factors as well, because you don't want to just be able to be like, okay, well, it's another big boss, but I can just bum rush him with a squad of 100 Pikmin. Having bosses that really make you kind of think outside of the box a little bit are really the best. Things like the Emperor Bullblacks in Pikmin 1. Sure, you can fight him straight on, but it's going to be really, really tough. You actually want to take a bunch of yellow Pikmin and a bunch of red Pikmin, split them up, take your yellow Pikmin, get some bomb rocks, bait him, and have him eat one of the bomb rocks from a yellow Pikmin, grab your reds, throw them onto his face until he gets unstunned, rinse and repeat. And it kind of gives you this sense of like, okay, well, I can strategize this a little bit and it'll make it easier. but I have to think about what I want to do. I gotta plan and coordinate ahead of time. You know what I mean? Pikmin 1, I think, does this very well, believe it or not, because it's, even though it's the first game in the series, I think it does a great job of this. It does a really, really good job of the whole resource management thing and having to be on top of things and strategize. Like I mentioned, the Emperor Bulblex fight really makes you think. Same thing with the Beady Longlegs, that fight in the Force Naval. Of course, you could always just rush in there with a group of 100 Pikmin, but he drops out of the sky, boom, he's going to snag like 15, 20 of your Pikmin when he lands. And then you'll find out that, oh, you can only throw Pikmin onto him while he's standing still. The only Pikmin that can reach him while he's moving around are the yellows. And then you find out pretty quickly that, like, oh, wait a minute, having a big group here is bad because it's hard to manage. So then you kind of want to like leave, re-strategize, and you go in with a small group of only yellows, of only like 20 or 30, and then just keep hitting them over and over and over again. And that actually makes it easier. Things like that, you have to strategize. Of course, there's some enemies that you can just bum rush, like the Puff Stool. You literally just throw a bunch of Pikmin on him, he'll die in one cycle. Like, it's stupid. But I think for the most part, this does a really good job of making you strategize, think ahead, plan a little bit, and really makes you exercise your brain. Make sure you know what you're doing before you get into it, because if you go into something unprepared, be ready to lose a whole shit ton of Pikmin and a whole day with no parts. So I think Pikmin 1 does a great job of this. Pikmin 2, I think, does an excellent job. I think, even though it doesn't have the day counter, you could argue that that takes away from it. While that does take away from it in one aspect, they return just as much, if not more, in the enemy department, in the cave department. You get more Pikmin, so you have more ways to strategize with all these different enemies that you have thrown at you. Some of the bosses are completely insane, like the Titan Weevil is an insanely long boss fight, especially if you don't have too many sprays at your disposal. He has elemental attacks that you really have to strategize around. You can really think of like, how am I going to tackle this? When to attack, when not to, when to run, what you're gonna do with the rest of the Pikmin that you're not using. It kind of calls for you to really think ahead of time. And a lot of bosses kind of make you do this too. And it's also like the bosses and enemies across the board, but the bosses specifically in this game have a lot more health than most of the bosses in Pikmin 1. And it really demands that you pick and choose when to use your spicy sprays and your bitter sprays, and when to use your purple Pikmin and when to save them. When to use your red Pikmin, when to use your yellows, when to use your blues. I think it just really calls on you to, pick and choose your battles and how you want to fight them. And each thing kind of has a couple different ways to do it. Like the final boss, you could take all your Pikmin colors into there and just switch them out based on what attack he goes for. Or you can just do what I do. I take a whole bunch of yellows in there. I just try to like avoid the attacks, except for the electricity one, because the electricity one's the most dangerous one. You can really kind of go at it either which way, and there's plenty of other bosses where you can like try to strategize different ways, see if you can get bosses to like get stuck in certain loops or stick themselves in certain places that are less advantageous and give you a chance to get more cycles in on them or more damage in on them. And like I said, managing your spicy sprays, because while you're in these caves, you're usually not going to get more sprays, and it kind of makes you think, okay, do I want to waste a bitter spray on floor 3? Or do I want to save it for these later floors when there's going to be more tougher enemies, and I'm probably going to have less Pikmin because some are going to be dead by then. So I think Pikmin 2 does a really good job of this. I do think that it could have done with some sort of soft time cap, at least for the main story of, getting 10,000 Pokos. I think there could have been something there. I don't know exactly what it would be. I'm not a game designer, so don't quote me in the comments. Be like, you got to figure this out, man. Like, I don't fucking know, bro. But yeah, I think this does a really good job of that. Pikmin 3, I'm looking at you, brother. I think this isn't a bad game, but I think it falls a little bit flat in comparison to its predecessors. I think it just doesn't quite hit the same marks quite as well. There are a couple of tough bosses, but they're not nearly as memorable, save for the Plasm Wraith right at the end of the game. Of course the final boss is going to be memorable, and it feels like such a huge difficulty spike right at the end of the game. Like, oh, most of the bosses have been pretty easy up until now, but oh, here's the final boss. He takes an entire day to beat. Good luck, brother. It kind of feels like a bit of an artificial like jump right at the end of the game, where you kind of need a whole day just to fight the final boss, and it's just kind of like very out of nowhere. Like, oh man, this fight's going to take me literally all day. I think that it definitely could do with a little more difficulty. And I think there are some really good ways to play this game. The ultra spicy mode in this game is pretty good. I'm actually going to play that for series pretty soon, I'm thinking. So stay tuned for that. Let me know if you want to see Pikmin 3 ultra spicy in the comments. I think that's a pretty good way to like make it more difficult. It's not the best way in my opinion. It feels a little artificial in my opinion, but that could just be me. Other than that, I think Pikmin 3 is, it just doesn't quite hit the same marks. It doesn't feel quite as tough, not quite as demanding as Pikmin 1 and 2 are. And you, right at the end, Pikmin 4. I think this is a little tougher than Pikmin 3, but not quite as tough as 1 and 2. I feel like the controls are really, really there in this game. Pikmin 1 and 2 had pretty good controls all across the board. The Wii revisions made them even better. Pikmin 3 had great controls. This game has great controls. Like, they're great across the board. Let's be real. I think that the GameCube ones are probably the weakest, if I had to say, but it doesn't really apply to Pikmin 1 and 2 as much because they have Wii versions that you can play very easily. They're easier to find these days, actually. The Switch ports are basically the Wii versions, but with a standard controller layout. And I think they're better than the GameCube controls, so I think it kind of balances that out a little bit. I think the worst way you could possibly play Pikmin is on the Wii U with the gamepad. I think that kind of sucks. I would rather play with the gamepad in front of me and use a Wii Remote and Nunchuck. I think that's a kabillion times better, let's be real. But I think Pikmin 4, it's really good in terms of the controls department. I think it's phenomenal. Everything's kind of where you expect it to be. It's not difficult to, control the game. Everything feels natural. And Pikmin management in this game specifically is very good. You can kind of like pile them on Ochi's back. They follow you very well. Their pathing is really good. In Pikmin 4 specifically, I feel like the controls are really, really there. I feel like the controls in this game might be some of the best. That and Pikmin 3's Go Here feature are like some of the best controls you can really ask for. It takes away from the difficulty a little bit, but I feel like it does less to take away from the strategy and does a whole lot more to add to the level of strategization you can make. So I feel like that's not really anything. I feel like you can't really make that a knock against it. You know what I mean? I think the enemies are a little more there in terms of the difficulty than Pikmin 3. That might just be a bit of a recency bias thing since I played this more recently than Pikmin 3. I do feel like the enemies in this game are a bit tougher. They're not quite as tough as the Pikmin 2 enemies, but I do think they're fairly tough, especially in the earlier game, where you don't have as many Pikmin. You really have to pick and choose your battles. So I think this game kind of hits it pretty good, dead down the middle. I'd like it to be a little tougher, personally. Like, if I was a game modder and I was like, I'm going to go mod Pikmin 4 and, like, make it more difficult, I would give some of the enemies a little more health, make certain things a little more common, make more enemies in certain areas. And I feel like that would just make it hit that just right, like, Goldilocks mark of difficulty, at least in my opinion. I think this is a very, very good game. And for our first Pikmin game in literally 10 years, I think this really hits the nail on the head. The bosses are fairly memorable in my opinion. Some of them aren't as much, but some of them are pretty freaking memorable. Some of the Dandori challenges and like the beats of the story are really there. It's a very memorable game, a lot of things to remember. I had a blast playing this on my stream. So yeah, I think this does a really good job. But if I had to rank the games personally, as the Pikmin guru with my official, unofficial ranking, we'll start at the bottom and work our way up. So I think probably the worst, quote unquote, Pikmin game, I'm gonna have to give it to Pikmin 3, which sucks because I like Pikmin 3 a lot. It's a really good game. Like, I can't really put anything against this. It's more of just that there are certain ways where it doesn't quite live up to its predecessors. Sure, the controls are a little better than Pikmin 1 and 2 in some ways. You have like the Go Here feature, which, by the way, fantastic. It really helps you strategize. You have the mini map that you can pull up on your gamepad and kind of strategize in real time. I think it's a great game. It controls pretty well, but I just think that it's just not quite difficult enough. You can definitely go play Ultra Spicy and get your difficulty that way. There are actually some mods out there that I've been thinking of playing. If you've seen the Pikmin 3 True Spice difficulty mod, it just makes things noticeably more harder. I've been meaning to play that on the channel, actually. Stay tuned for that, actually. Let me know if you want that or Ultra Spicy first. But I think in its base state, I think it's just the weakest. Not that it's bad in any means. And as a matter of fact, in my opinion, when somebody's like, hey, yo, dude, like, I want to play Pikmin. I've never really played much Pikmin before. I want to get into it. What game should I start with? I usually point them to 3. Even though Pikmin 4 is out now, I point them to 3 and say, hey, go, like, if you have a Switch, go on eBay, get a used copy of Pikmin 3 Deluxe on your Switch, because you could pick them up for well under $60 at this point. Pick up a used copy of Pikmin 3 Deluxe on the Switch, or wait for it to go on sale for Black Friday or whatever, and it'll be a great introduction to the series, because 3 Deluxe, like, it adds more difficulty levels. There's an easy mode, which is a little easier than base Pikmin 3, then there's the regular difficulty, and then there's the ultra spicy. So I think that really makes it accessible to newcomers, which, by the way, it's so good that they made this game so accessible to newcomers, because the one flaw, I think, of the first 2 games is that it's hard for people to get into them. It kind of lets you dip your toes into the water before it throws you in, and so I feel like this is a really good game for people to start out on. In doing so, it kind of makes itself a little bit weaker of a Pikmin game, just because because of the level of ease that it has. So I think that is why this goes on the bottom. Not because it's bad, just because the others are a little better. Our next game could kind of go 2 ways here, in my opinion, but I want to say that it's probably Pikmin 1. It's really close between this and my number 2 ranking here. This game is really good in terms of the difficulty and the resource management department. I think it might be actually the best in terms of the resource management thing, just because of how little time you get. I think it's a very, very well designed thing. But once you play through it a couple times, it kind of it weakens a little bit, just because you get better at the game and you kind of know how to get multiple parts in a day much more easily. You can really, really get your times down. But I feel like that's part of where the fun comes from. That could just be me. I feel like this game is number 3 because it isn't as good in the controls department. I'm still very, like, of course, the first game, so the controls aren't really going to be perfect. I feel like that's a little bit of a knock against it, especially the GameCube release. It kind of suffers a little bit in that regard. And like I said, you can't hold it against it too much. You have the Wii version, which makes the controls way better. But if we're going to kind of lump all the releases of Pikmin 1 together, it kind of averages out to a pretty good but not great score. And the enemy difficulty is a little inconsistent, like the fiery blowhogs. You literally just use red Pikmin against them, and you can't lose Pikmin, but it's also like they take forever to kill because they have so much health. And the Wollywogs have like a ton of health for like literally no reason. But then there are other enemies that you can like walk all over. If you go up to any Bulborb or Bulbear and just bum rush them with a bunch of red Pikmin, they die instantly. So I feel like the difficulty, while it's there, is a little inconsistent between enemies. So I think that's why it goes at number 3 here. Moving on to our number 2 spot, I think Pikmin 4. I don't think that it's quite as tough as Pikmin 1, especially in terms of the resource management thing. It definitely has its own way of managing your resources and managing your time, but I feel like it definitely falls flat a little bit more in the difficulty department, just because you don't, like I said, you don't have a day counter. You can take as long as you want to beat this game, it doesn't really matter. And even Pikmin 3, being as lenient as it is with its day limit, there is something going there. So if you're not as good at the game yet, it's your first time going through, if you're not too sure what you're doing yet, you could lose your first time through just because you don't know where to find all the fruit and you're having trouble. You could run out of time and run out of fruit. This game, you can't run out of time. So I feel like it falls flat a little bit in that regard, but the difficulty does come from other factors. The areas are massive. There's plenty of strategization to be done in terms of making sure your home base is located in the right spot, using Ochi to the best of your ability, really strategizing and Dandorying your day to the best of your ability. So I feel like it's not as much of a difficulty thing and more of just like a how good can I do this? Like how effectively can I complete this challenge? How effectively can I get this done? Which is kind of what Pikmin has always been about. Getting things done as quickly as possible. And the stress of that kind of comes from the difficulty of the game. But and I feel like this game is just difficult enough to kind of keep that fair, to keep that point relevant. It's not quite as difficult as 1 and 2 in my opinion, but it's difficult enough that the incentive of strategy is still very prevalent. So I feel like that's why it goes at number 2. So I feel like that means you all know what my number 1 pick is. It's Pikmin 2. Say all you want about me having a little bit of bias because this was my first Pikmin game ever that I played a lot of and first Pikmin game that I actually beat. I think this is the best Pikmin game. And to be fair, I would say that personally, Pikmin 2 isn't even leaps and bounds better than Pikmin 3. I feel like Pikmin 2 is like a 9.5 out of 10 and Pikmin 3 is an 8 out of 10. So like we're kind of picking and we're really getting down to fine decisions here. Some of this definitely comes down to a level of preference, but let me explain why. you could argue that, like, okay, you have no time counter, but the strategization really comes down to what you do in caves, and the caves really, really demand that you really play carefully, because if you make a mistake, especially in these later game longer caves, like the Frontier Cavern, the Subterranean Complex, like the Dream Den, the Hole of Heroes, these later game caves that you get to that are way longer, they really demand that you play your cards right and make sure you're using every Pikmin that you have to the best of its ability and playing as carefully as you can to make sure you don't lose too many of them, because if you do, you can't leave whenever you want. You have to either keep fighting on and work with the lower numbers that you have until you find a geyser or get to the end of the cave, or you have to literally give up and go back to the surface. And in doing so, you give up all the treasure that you found, so you have to completely redo the cave. And on top of that, you still suffer the loss of the pig. The strategization, even though people will say like, oh, there's no day counter, so the difficulty's not there. The difficulty is there. It's all in the caves, which you could argue against it to a degree, and I would understand, but I feel like that's really where the strategization of this game shines. That's not to say that there's none on the surface. There are definitely some ways where you can like really strategize how you do certain things on the surface. There are definitely things to be done up there that you need to be careful with a little bit. How you use your time up there is also pretty important, because that is where time passes. And you have to use your time up there pretty effectively, because I feel like the areas are a little bigger than in Pikmin 1. So some of the items are pretty far away from the ship. You gotta pick and choose what caves you want to go into at what times. The Submerged Castle, insanely difficult cave. Love it to death though, because it really makes you work around the limitations of just having blue Pikmin and having to work around, okay, well, now there's these fiery Bulblaxes. How am I going to kill these? Okay, well, now there's these enemies. What am I going to do about this? And then it gives you Bulbmin, and you can kind of strategize with them and figure out like where to use them, because you only have so many, and you have to be very careful because of the limited resources that you have. And I feel like this game could have done with a little more of those, but I think this game overall is the best Pikmin game. That definitely comes down to a little bit of preference. You could argue just as much that Pikmin 1 is the best. You could argue just as much that Pikmin 4 is the best. But I do feel like this game, the controls are a step up from Pikmin 1. Even on the GameCube, they're more than serviceable. They still hold up today like a dream on all platforms. So I feel like Pikmin 2, like the controls are really good across the board. The bosses are super memorable. Like there's tons and tons of memorable bosses. You have the Pileated Snagger, you have the Man-at Legs, you have the final boss in the Titan Dweevil. You have the Raging Longlegs. That guy's terrifying the first time you fight him, bro. I remember when I was a kid, I was like 12 years old. The first time I saw a Raging Longlegs, I about flipped my shit in the living room, bro. I was losing my goddamn mind. There are so many memorable bosses in this game that really make you just like, they really jump out in your head and make you like, the Emperor's Bulblax is a really another memorable one, because you see it multiple times, and every time you see it, it gets tougher and tougher. Like every part of this game is very memorable. The areas are gorgeous. They're super memorable. They're tough. They're challenging. They make you really think about how you want to use your time, how to manage your resources in these caves, how much time you want to spend gathering resources before you go into the cave. Things like that. It's really, I think this is overall, I think Pikmin 2 is probably the best Pikmin game ever. You could argue me on that. I would definitely entertain an argument that Pikmin 1's the best. I could totally see that, because while the controls aren't quite as there as much, hard time cap, there's more factors in place making sure that you strategize and don't just farm for stuff. You could argue that Pikmin 4 is just as difficult in certain ways. You could even argue in certain ways that Pikmin 3 is tough if you want to count Ultra Spicy mode. Every game has a little bit of an argument to make for it. But I think all in all, I think Pikmin 2 just comes out on top. But I don't know. What do you guys think? Let me know down in the comments, because I want to see what everybody thinks about all the different Pikmin games. I think Pikmin 2 is the best Pikmin game across the board in terms of the difficulty and everything, but I want to hear other people's arguments. So do let me know. Like, I'm totally down to have a discussion in the comments. So let me know, and leave a like if you enjoyed this video, because I had a lot of fun, like, thinking of what I wanted to do for this, scripting it, making it. And if you liked it, subscribe, because that lets me know that you want to see more of this. I usually don't plug this kind of stuff, but at the end of the day, like, if this is something you guys want to see, just do something. Let me know you want to see it. Comment or like or whatever you want to do. I don't really care. Send a carrier pigeon to my house. Just let me know, like, if you think this is cool, because I think this is cool. If you think this is cool, I can totally do more stuff like this. But I think all the Pikmin games are so good, and I think they're a phenomenal series to get into. Now more than ever is just a great game franchise to really invest yourself in. Other than that, I'm Akina329. I'll see you later.